even the President of the United States. And the immediate knee-jerk sort of reaction is, of course, to talk back. And I think, as I said, he knew that the Americans could actually tolerate quite a large sort of a latitude of, for example, being insulted and so on. So he is going on with his insulting, but as a previous speaker also said, there is at some point some limit to it. Yeah.
Right, and Saurabh, that rhetoric escalated very quickly into a slanging match. Let's listen to what President Duterte had to say.
So I do not expect the human rights, I do not expect Obama, I do not expect the EU to understand me. Do not understand me. And if you think it is high time for you guys to withdraw your assistance, go ahead. We will not beg for it.
So he's saying that we don't care about the assistance you're giving us. If you don't want to give it to us any longer, that's fine. Now, as Richard pointed out, we don't know whether that's just bluster or whether he means that. But what do you make of it?
Here's an interesting facet which I think not many people touch upon, but I think is a very important one. Asia is seeing a new and different breed of leaders who have come out who are not from the existing elite or from the metropolitan centers. We've seen that in Jokowi in Indonesia. We've seen that in Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. We're seeing that with Duterte in Philippines, and to some extent even Modi in India, though the US has good relations out there. And the US has been...
We're seeing that in the US as well, aren't we?
Well, exactly, we are. And the point is the US has been happy to talk about democracy and has promoted democracy, but has preferred to work through oligarchs in those countries. Now, Duterte comes in with a very rough and ready view of how he wants to tackle challenges which are close to his heart. And the US has difficulty coming to terms with this sort of leader, has not done this sort of outreach with provincial leaders, and is not used to this form of functioning and style. And so this sort of relationship can degenerate quickly. Of course, another thing that the US doesn't grasp too well about this is, you know, Southeast Asia has been an arena, and South Asia has been an arena where there has been colonialism, where the brunt of that colonialism has been from white countries. Unlike in East Asia, like Korea, where the main problem, or China, where the main problem was Japanese imperialism. And so the alliance structures that it has in East Asia do not easily translate in the same way and speak to the masses and their leaders in the same way that it does in Southeast Asia. And the US, I don't think, is approaching these and understands these underlying drivers that well. And that's why it needs to be a little cautious. Yes, President Duterte has said a lot of things he should not be saying and should be framing it a little bit more diplomatically. But the US must try to understand a little bit more about where and how these leaders are also coming.
Victor, just a few months ago, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled against China for the Philippines in that territorial dispute over the South China Sea. Now, the Philippines, which one could say won that dispute, is calling for a strengthening of relations with China. What's the significance of that change? That's all happened very quickly.
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, that ruling by the arbitration court based in The Hague is illegal, and China has presented its reasoning why it is illegal and why China is not going to accept its ruling or to implement the ruling, etc. And this is all on the record. And I would say that if you look around the world, there are many territorial disputes between different pairs of countries, and between China and the Philippines, indeed, there is territorial dispute. But the better way to resolve the territorial dispute, including between China and the Philippines, is to conduct diplomacy and negotiation and talk it over and try to reach an amicable solution for the two countries. And I think for President Duterte and the Philippines under his leadership, this is exactly what's the better way between China and the Philippines to engage in diplomacy, to engage in peaceful dialogue. And meanwhile, even though there may be these territorial disputes, we still can, put them aside for a while and focus on cooperation between the two countries. In China, if you do that right, there could be huge demand for many products and services from the Philippines, and this will help the Philippines to create many good jobs in the Philippines and boost its export to China. And China can also provide lots of assistance in terms of financing and infrastructure capabilities. This is exactly what the Filipino people would benefit from. Therefore, I think, even though the Hague Arbitration Court has made its decision, which China rejected, between China and the Philippines, let's talk, let's negotiate, let's try our best to resolve the territorial dispute. But meanwhile, let's embrace each other as close neighbors, let's improve our relations, let's do trade with each other, let's help each other to boost our economic development, and let's both benefit from this kind of mutually beneficial business in trade and economic relations with each other. That's the better way. That's the high way. It's not the low way of as if there will be no more tomorrow if you do not resolve the territorial dispute between the two countries.
Richard, you have written that the new Philippines outreach to China has made it almost impossible for the United States and its allies to rally global pressure on China. Is that a big setback for the United States?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. Actually, in the Philippines, within the bureaucracy, among a lot of people, there's a huge disappointment that President Duterte has not openly used the arbitration case to mobilize international support. And clearly, that is what the United States had in mind. I think President Obama was expecting that the Philippines will use the arbitration case to put more pressure on China, to mobilize the ASEAN, and perhaps even call for freedom of navigation operations by U.S. and other countries like Japan. But that didn't happen. I think for Duterte, what's important here, as of now, is to prevent war and manage the disputes. And while Duterte has been contradicting himself whether the negotiations with China will be with regards within the framework of the arbitration award or not, I think what we're looking at here is that China will continue to reject the arbitration case as illegal, although that's not the point of view of a lot of countries. But I think behind the scenes in their negotiations, they will try to find a compromise that at least partially conforms with that final award. And I think one low-hanging fruit is, for instance, a joint fisheries agreement or a modus vivendi in the Scarborough Shoal, because the award clearly said that the Scarborough Shoal is a traditional fishing ground, not only for China, not only for the Philippines, but for multiple countries. So I think that is where much of the negotiations in the coming months will focus on. And I think if the two countries can find an understanding over the Scarborough Shoal, that will tremendously contribute to bringing down tensions and mutual animosity, not only between the governments, but the peoples of China and the Philippines.
So, Rob, so you've got this tough rhetoric coming out of Manila. What are the policy options here for the United States? And one other thing, very quickly, how are other countries in the region looking at this change in dynamics, countries like Japan, South Korea?
Let me get to the second question first. Let me split that into two sections, actually. There are countries, there are the ASEAN countries, first of all, and then there are the countries beyond ASEAN. The ASEAN countries are actually thankful that the arbitration is over, because the arbitration over means the closing of a chapter, which means the beginning of a new chapter, and a new chapter which can go in a more positive direction. And China has shown itself willing and wanting to go in that positive direction post the arbitration. So they've been actually happy about it. Maybe there's a little bit of disgruntlement at the side of the Vietnamese, because they have also in the process won some significant gains from that arbitration process. But the fact is that they made very serious progress, or good progress, I would say, at the ASEAN level summits, the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Ministerial in July, and even subsequently. So the ASEAN countries are generally, I would say, are happy with the way things have turned out subsequently. The other countries, you have countries like Japan, who actually were an accessory of the US and have been disappointed with the way the matters have played out. But then you have countries like India, another extra-regional country, who has been able to find a middle ground between where the ASEAN countries are and where the US and Japan is. So it's a kind of a mixed bag in that regard. I don't think anybody ever thought that freedom of navigation was being denied in the first place in the South China Sea. So there isn't any great anxieties happening from that perspective. But The situation is obviously still a very fluid one, and we need to see where it goes.
So what would policymakers here in the United States be looking at right now when they see this change in the relationship with the Philippines?
What they will do is, I assume, maintain a low-key approach at this point of time.
Right.
The United States can't get too far ahead wanting to say, let's go in, let's put the pressure on China, when the ASEAN countries and Philippines themselves, who are the key players in this dispute, are not involved. And Obama saw a little bit of that in the East Asia Summit, where he tried to say, oh, I'm going to bring a little bit of a negative tone out here. There's not that much space for that, but a lot will depend on how China intelligently utilizes this moment with the Philippines on South China Sea issues in terms of negotiating certain space for the two parties, because so long as the Philippines can be fairly satiated or satisfied in its dealings with China, it doesn't open that much space for the United States or Japan, Australia to intervene in that dispute. So they will not get ahead of the Philippines.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. This week's state visit by the Philippines president marks a new beginning for China-Philippines relations. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte agreed their two countries will set aside differences over the South China Sea and work together to improve bilateral ties. The two sides signed 13 agreements covering trade and the economy, infrastructure, the fight against illegal drugs, and maritime cooperation. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Wang Tongxian in Beijing. And Tongxian, China and the Philippines have just released a joint statement on President Duterte's visit. Was the dispute over the territorial claims in the South China Sea addressed?
Yes, and the Asian neighbors agree that negotiation and dialogue is the most effective way to solve the maritime dispute on the South China Sea. And this is one of the major outcomes of Duterte's Beijing visit. Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Liu Zhenming said the friendship between the both countries have now been fully restored, and their cooperation will now enter a new phase. And China and the Philippines would also restore cooperation mechanisms on diplomatic consultations, defense and security consultation, and political party and Congress exchanges. So a new chapter for bilateral ties, really, Anand.
Dr. In an interview with CCTV, President Duterte said only China can help the Philippines. What's the potential for economic and political cooperation between these two countries?
Well, warmer ties between China and the Philippines are definitely encouraging for their economy. The Philippines can expect more Chinese tourists, and this will bring about estimated revenue of $1 billion in 1 year. Also, this is predicted that bilateral trade will reach $60 billion in 5 years and create some 250,000 jobs. Furthermore, Manila has been invited to join China's Maritime Silk Road initiative, so it can benefit from regional economic cooperation. And it's more than just economic benefits. Both countries are now seeing common waters with the South China Sea disputes. They are looking at joint Coast Guard control to safeguard peace and stability in this region. This really gives China a good chance to make good on its argument that Asian diplomacy without intervention of outside parties can be win-win, even for those who have territorial disputes, Anand.
Now, China has supported the efforts of the new Philippine government in its fight against drugs, unlike the United States. What kind of assistance is China offering the Philippines?
That's right. Beijing has promised to support President Duterte's battle against drugs through two ways: financial support and law enforcement cooperation. Duterte said about 4 million Filipinos are embroiled in illegal drug trade. To bring down the numbers, besides the harsh stance against the drug cartels and dealers, the Philippine government plans to build more rehabilitation centers. In November, there will be actually one opening founded by a Chinese businessman. Duterte's office also said China has committed more than $9 billion in low-interest loans to the country, and about 15 million will go towards a drug rehabilitation programs. So, Anand.
Thanks, Tongxian. That's CCTV's Wang Tongxian reporting from Beijing. Joining us now from Manila is Richard Javed Haidarian. He's an assistant professor of political science at De La Salle University and the author of Asia's New Battlefield, the USA, China and the Struggle for the Western Pacific. From Beijing, we're joined by Yang Xiu. He's a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Michael Kugelman. He's a senior program associate for South and Southeast Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks a lot to all of you for joining us. Richard, here we have two countries that had some major differences only a few months ago. Now we have President Duterte going to Beijing. What's the significance of this visit?
Well, in a very fascinating turn of events, within almost 3 months, the Philippines has gone from one of the fiercest critics of China, from a country that likened China to Nazi Germany on 2 occasions, now to a potential ally, or at least that is what President Duterte has been trying to say during his trip in China. Now, this trip in itself was highly symbolic. Why? Because usually Filipino presidents go to the United States or other major powers before they visit China. But for President Duterte, this is his first major state visit. And in fact, initially it was Japan which was supposed to be the first state visit for him, but he bumped down the Japanese in favor of Beijing, but he will soon be in Japan. Nonetheless, huge economic deals. Around $13.5 billion of business deals have been signed, $3 billion of infrastructure investment on the part of China. So he has a lot of economic goodies to bring home and try to portray China as a benevolent power. But the problem here is, what are the concessions he got in the South China Sea? Because while President Duterte said he doesn't want to bring up the issue because he doesn't want to rock the boat, for the Filipino people, that's the most important issue at this point in time. They want China to also show goodwill. They want also some compromise, at least in the Scarborough Shoal.
Yang Xiu, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has described this visit as a milestone. Let's watch part of what he said. Let's watch.
I hope we can follow the wishes of the people from the standpoint of mutually essential and common interests, and use this visit as an opportunity to push China-Philippines relations back on friendly footing and improve the relationship in all aspects.
So, Yang Xiu, here we have two countries that just had a major diplomatic spat over territorial claims in the South China Sea. So in that respect, how much of a reset is this for both countries?
Well, this visit by Filipino president will open a new chapter by the bilateral relation between China and the Philippines because of 2 reasons. On one hand, the 2 sides have determined to conduct a wide range of comprehensive cooperations. Secondly, the 2 sides agreed to manage the difference on South China Sea issue in a proper way, at a proper level. At least both sides agree the disputes or differences on South China Sea is a tail, the bilateral relation as a dog. The dog should strike the tail rather than the tail strike the dog. That was the situation Duterte's predecessor made. So the 2 sides had determined to change the situation into the positive direction.
Michael, the Philippines has been a long-standing ally of the United States. They have very close diplomatic ties, historical ties, as well as military ties as well. President Duterte's visit has been described as a rebalancing of Philippines diplomacy towards China. So what is the significance for U.S. strategic and political interests in the region?
Well, it's absolutely huge because the Philippines is not just a friend of the United States. It's a critical alliance partner, an ally for so many years, a country that's been in a position to help project U.S. interests across the Asia-Pacific, this being a region where the U.S. has in many ways been very absent. For all this talk about the U.S. rebalancing to Asia, it keeps getting distracted by things in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the Philippines is really key. And what I was struck by was the reaction from the U.S. government, from the spokespersons in the State Department and the White House, where they seemed utterly shocked about what Duterte had said about separation from the U.S. and so forth. You know, you didn't have these U.S. government spokespersons come out there and say, well, we're going to work through this and we still value our relationship. There was this literal shock in which, you know, you essentially heard these spokespersons say, we're going to need to get clarification on this. And I think there's going to be a very key visit this weekend when a top U.S. official Danny Russell will be in Manila, and I think that he's going to hope to try to get that clarification then.
Richard, you've written that that by declaring a strong alliance with China, President Duterte is going against the Filipino people's inclination towards the United States. So in that respect, what's motivating this move by the Philippines president?
Well, first of all, we are only talking about statements, not specific policy. We are yet to see whether the Philippine government will really move forward with, quote-unquote, separating itself with the United States and jumping into the Chinese camp. I really doubt that's going to happen, but that's the statement he has made. Nonetheless, those kinds of statements have not sat well with a lot of Filipinos. You hear a lot of sarcastic comments by Filipinos saying that the Sultan of Sulu has now visited the Ming dynasty, that this was not like a state visit, it was like a tributary visit. For many Filipinos, they felt the president was too deferential to a very country that is occupying Philippine claimed territories and preventing the Philippines from enjoying sovereign rights within its own exclusive economic zone. So back at home, many people were raising their eyebrows, while in China, I noticed there was a very positive reception of the president. Now, he is going against the grain of public opinion if he really wants to move closer to China at the expense of U.S. There was a survey that came out just 2 days ago that showed the United States enjoys a positive 66 net approval rating. That means super majority of Filipinos still like the United States. This is one of the highest rates in the world. China has a negative 33 net approval rating, which means majority of Filipinos have a negative view of China. So he's not actually in sync with the public opinion, and that will put a lot of restrictions on how actually he can move forward with translating his rhetoric of separation into actual policy. Not to mention, his own cabinet members have tried to downplay his statement and to say that this is usual Duterte bravado. There's no guideline or specific instructions yet for us to move forward with an actual separation from the United States.
Right, Richard, he might not be in sync with public opinion as far as this issue is concerned, but he still does enjoy 76% approval rating among the Philippines public.
Yes, he is still in his honeymoon rates, so he's enjoying what I call honeymoon discount rates. He's popular. That is why he's still getting away with this kind of controversial statements, which has raised eyebrows among people. But the Philippine military and the security establishment will watch him very carefully. And for them, their relationship with the United States is extremely important. The U.S. has been a source of full spectrum assistance to the Philippine military, logistics, finance, training, among other things. So I think President Duterte will carefully consider the reaction of the Philippine political and security establishment when he really wants to translate his statements to actual policy. Nonetheless, I won't be surprised if President Duterte slightly downgrades security relationship with the U.S. by canceling any joint military exercises in the South China Sea and not to give American more access in Subic, Clark, and other major bases facing South China Sea as a form of concessions to China, and in exchange ask the Chinese to give him some concessions in the Scarborough Shoal and other contested areas in the South China Sea. So some slight downgrading in relations with the U.S. is more or less on the horizon, but completely separating from the United States, I think that was more hyperbole than actual policy statement.
Yang Xiu, as far as the South China Sea issue is concerned, the two sides have issued a joint statement, was issued a short while ago, in which they've now agreed to resolve their differences through negotiation and diplomacy. In fact, the word that was used was consensus. What does that mean?
Well, from Chinese point of view, we understand the new Filipino government has changed to the position for solving this issue, disputes by negotiation, by bilateral negotiation with China, meanwhile explore the ways for the joint development. That is a positive signal, a positive direction supported by China. Actually, for the long time, China has been calling for direct negotiation among...
Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the strained relationship between the Philippines and the United States and efforts by the Philippine president to revive ties with China. Let's get back to our panel right now. Isana, we talked a moment ago about the war on drugs. The immediate reason for the breakdown in the relationship between